Number one, this type of theory of meaning would not only eliminate God's statements, it would eliminate ethical statements, aesthetic statements, many metaphysical statements, and many scientific statements, like statements about quarks, strings, other high-level theoretical entities in science. Secondly, even worse, this verification theory of meaning is self-refuting. If you say to be meaningful, a proposition must be verifiable, what about that very proposition? Is it verifiable? Well, no, it's just an arbitrary definition. So that it was very soon realized that this verification theory of meaning, if it were true, it's meaningless. So that it's a self-refuting theory. And therefore, this verification theory of meaning that Mr. Zindler is propounding has been abandoned universally today by epistemologists, theorists of knowledge. So that it is not at all absurd to say that you have to give some sort of argument against God if you're going to maintain atheism. He says, well, maybe I'm God. Well, I think this just trivializes the debate this evening. Mr. Zindler obviously didn't bring about the origin of the universe or design it. He's not the source of absolute moral value. If we're going to have a serious debate, I think we need to weigh the alternatives that are really credible. So I haven't seen any refutation of my first three arguments for a creator, a designer, or a source of moral values. What about the evidence for God's revealing himself in Jesus? Here, all we got, frankly, from Mr. Zindler was a series of assertions, but no evidence to support them. He says, but the Gospels aren't credible. Why take them seriously? They're not eyewitnesses. Let me make a couple of quick points. Number one, he falsely assumes that only an eyewitness can write accurate history. And that just evinces an incredible historiographical naivete. It's positively medieval, literally, in its understanding of history. It would mean that today nobody could write a history of the American Civil War, for example. So that just because some of the gospel writers aren't eyewitnesses, you can't throw them out as unreliable. Secondly, he falsely assumes that a historically reliable document must be inerrant. He has a sort of all-or-nothing mentality. If there's any errors, then the whole document is worthless as a historical source. And again, that would just destroy the whole study of history. The task of the critical scholar is to sort out the historical from the unhistorical elements. One could admit all of the discrepancies Mr. Zindler mentions and still hold that the Gospels warrant the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead and are fundamentally reliable sources for a life of Jesus. In fact, this is precisely the position that many biblical critics do hold. And remember, this isn't a debate tonight over biblical inerrancy. It's a debate over who was Jesus and his resurrection. And I would maintain, number three, that the Gospels are fundamentally reliable. I can only look at one example, Luke. Luke was not an eyewitness, but he was a traveling companion of Paul. And as such, he traveled to Jerusalem where he interviewed people who were eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. His accuracy in the book of Acts is indisputable. Best demonstration of this is a recent book by Colin Hemer called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Hemer combs the book of Acts, sorting out incredible historical detail that is confirmed by papyrological and epigraphical evidence from the first century. Sir William Ramsay's judgment still stands. Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed among the very greatest of historians. Now let me contrast with that Mr. Zindler's view on the origin of Christianity. He believes Jesus never existed. He says the character now known of Christ as Christ was the product of an unstably rotating earth. Right. He thinks that the earth rotated in such a way that the zodiacal signs shifted around the time of the birth of Christ, and this caused wise men to come from the east seeking a new God, and their visit prompted the Jews to believe their messianic expectations had already been fulfilled. Let me just mention 3 points about this. Number one, it's astronomically impossible. The ancients could not have observed the change in the equinox from Aries to Pisces, as Mr. Zindler says. Noel Zwerdlow, who's professor of astronomy at the University of Chicago, made this point. He said, to think that people in antiquity could distinguish between the different signs is ludicrous, because only later did people place borders around the stars. This was done for modern cataloging purposes in 1900 at the Astronomical Union. This line of thinking, that is Mr. Zindler's, is clearly invented and not at all representative of what the people in that time saw. What he has written has absolutely no historical value whatsoever. Secondly, it's even worse. He gratuitously accepts the visit of the wise men as historical while rejecting better established and universally accepted facts about the historical Jesus. He rejects the crucifixion, he rejects the existence of Jesus, but he accepts the visit of the wise men. What makes this ironic is that the wise man story is one of those that's usually rejected by critical biblical scholars today. So this is just intellectual hypocrisy. It's sort of picking and choosing what you want to believe. Thirdly, the Jews couldn't possibly have believed that the Messiah had already come and done what was prophesied of him, because they expected a temporal political Messiah. So long as they still labored under the Roman yoke, they couldn't possibly have believed their messianic expectations were fulfilled. In fact, that leads to another question: why is the Jesus of the gospel so different from the Jewish messianic expectations? If he was supposedly the imaginary product of those expectations. In particular, there was no expectation of a dying and rising Messiah. You can't explain the origin of Christianity through these influences, because there was no expectation of it. What about pagan influences on the disciples? Well, the fact is that according to Gerhard Kittel, there is virtually no trace in Palestine in the first century of these pagan myths of dying and rising gods. So that their influence upon the disciples, I think, is simply unthinkable. So that we've yet to see any explanation for the consensus of scholarship today that the tomb was empty, they saw appearances of Jesus alive, and they originated this belief in his resurrection without any prior sort of pagan, Christian, or Jewish influences. Again, then, it seems to me that it's pretty obvious that the evidence points toward Christianity as the more plausible worldview.
Well, I'm glad to see that he has read my article on how Jesus got a life. But I must say that I did not assert for sure that the Magi were real. I simply thought that would be a useful thing. If it were true, it could explain some things. But we don't need to believe that the Magi, in the sense of the Bible story, were historical. But there were, of course, Magi. These were Mithraic astrologers who did travel around. One of their centers was Tarsus. You may have heard of somebody else from Tarsus. We're told that the verification principle is passé, but curiously, he did not do anything to try to refute the simple truth that I am God and created you all 3 minutes ago. The only way you can get out of that dilemma is if this verificationist principle, or something very similar to it, is correct. And it is not indeed a meta statement. That statement itself is unverifiable. It is simply an observation. This is how we do, in fact, determine whether we can make sense out of anything, is if we can imagine a way, at least in principle, that we could test it. And those things that we can't even imagine a way to test, we just shrug off and go on to something else. And again, the problem of universal negative, there are many, 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 many gods that have been claimed, and how to disprove all of them, I wouldn't imagine to know. With regard to polka-dotted geese, that is also a universal negative, to try to disprove that somewhere in the universe at some time there never was a polka-dotted goose. So I'm not going to try to disprove that one either. Purple polka-dotted geese and gods are both a little bit tough to handle in this sense. Now, he keeps coming back to the circumstantial species of the ad hominem, and there are two species of ad hominem. There is the abusive species, where you just simply call somebody a name, and the circumstantial species, where you appeal to the special circumstances either of your opponent or to the audience, and hope that that will sway them. For example, if somebody is on trial for abusing animals, and you give an impassioned speech that abusing animals is awful and animals shouldn't have to suffer, That's all well and good, but it does nothing to prove the guilt of the person being tried. And so this idea of a moral vacuum, if the Christian God does not exist, is irrelevant.